hate the dry winter months because it means cracked knuckles and lotion. And lotion just feels so gross. Hello and welcome to Madison Reviews. To all the boys, P.S. I still love you. This is a review of the movie, more or less like my own opinion about the movie. Needless to say, spoiler alert, if you have not seen this film, I recommend not watching this video until you watch the movie. Just so that I don't spoil the ending for you. So, I have warned you right now, there will be spoilers in this video. Don't get mad at me if I spoil something for you because I literally just said spoiler alert. So at this point, if you spoil it for yourself, it's your own fault. First of all, I learned that the director for this movie changed compared to the first one. And I think that change is pretty obvious. For some reason, and I don't want to necessarily blame the director for this, but the director probably had something to do with a little bit of this, but the magic that was there in the first movie is just kind of gone in the second one for me. Oh yeah, by the way, To All the Boys, P.S. I Still Love You is the sequel to All the Boys I've Loved Before, which is a fantastic movie and I highly recommend you go check it out. Again, that magic that was there the first movie is just kind of gone the second movie. There's just something a little off about it. We don't quite get the same charm in the second one as we do in the first. And maybe my review will go into a little bit more detail on why, for me, the second movie didn't live up to the first. Let's talk about that beginning. The movie starts off with an amazing song, but I was also like, this looks oddly familiar. And pretty soon, I was like, this is the beginning to Adventures in Babysitting, which is another fantastic movie, and I highly recommend you go and check it out if you haven't already. It's great. Pretty much the only thing, like the only difference from Adventures in Babysitting and P.S. I Still Love You is Elizabeth's shoe. That's pretty much it. And so while I'm thinking this, I'm like, they're trouble? Aren't they gonna get in trouble for that? Because I was like, the choreography is the same sort of like acting is the same, and I was a little concerned because I was like, you are literally scamming on Adventures in Babysitting. But it turned out okay because then Kitty came by and paused her laptop and was like, really? Adventures in Babysitting? So my whole freak out about that's Adventures in Babysitting was addressed. So kudos to them for that. But I was still a little concerned with like the fact that it opened up the same way that Adventures in Babysitting did. However, you might think like, oh, it started off the exact same way, so it's gonna be the same premise as Adventures in Babysitting. Like, you might start to draw comparisons. I personally never did that. They're just completely different storylines. So I really don't think you have to worry about drawing comparisons between the two. But that's how the movie started out. That was my first impression going into this movie, was like, they scammed on Adventures in Babysitting, that's not good. So my first impression already from the start wasn't that great. Again, I didn't draw comparisons between them, so I wasn't like trying to have P.S. I Still Love You meet the expectations of Adventures in Babysitting. This will be the last time I mention Adventures in Babysitting. As the movie went on, I started to get this feeling that the whole movie was just this long commercial for the soundtrack. There was even a part of the movie that made me go, Like, I just kind of questioned the direction of the film, especially that one scene. Lara Jean starts literally mouthing the words to the song that's playing, and I was like, am I watching a music video all of a sudden? Don't get me wrong, I think the soundtrack is actually pretty good, but especially at the part where she's, lip syncing the words. It made me feel like that this whole thing was like an elaborate commercial for the soundtrack, for the music itself. So there were just some directional takes that kind of took away from my experience and made me go, what is even going on? In a previous video, I did a slight rant, a detour rant, on some of the problems that I see in young adult fiction, whether film or literature. And I think, unfortunately, this movie kind of shows some of those points that I was talking about as like what's wrong with YA. That's not to say that this is a necessarily toxic relationship, because while I was thinking about it, it wasn't like the toxicity levels as some of the other stuff that's out there, but there's definitely stuff to work on. But I also think that that could be a very good thing had they done it right. Now, there is a third movie apparently coming out based on this, so we'll see how the third movie wraps it up. But as of right now, it's starting to head into this direction where it can take the bad stuff and kind of turn it into good lessons. So I don't want to totally crap on this movie about its young teenager love stuff, but I do want to kind of take us through point by point of some of the things that I think illuminate the problems I have personally with YA in film and literature. First of all, as the movie progresses, and it's pretty clear that they make it obvious Laura Jean and Peter have nothing in common. The one scene that sticks out the most in my head is when they're at the party and Peter is socializing, and I think he's playing beer pong, I don't remember. He's socializing, he's having fun. Laura Jean is over with one of her friends, and they're just sitting there, just talking. And Laura Jean is just chilling by herself, which, like, same. But I think that scene does a really good job in demonstrating, the distance that's coming between them, but also the fact that they are very different people. And the film does touch on that as it goes on. The other thing that, to me, kind of spells disaster, not total destruction, but just kind of something that will definitely need to be worked on if it's touched upon at all in the third movie. Pretty much since the beginning of their relationship, fake or otherwise, they've been lying or hiding things from each other the entire time. In this movie, we learn that when Peter is in the hot tub, which is like a super popular scene, it's one of the most memorable, in my opinion, from the first movie, we learn that Peter was actually waiting for his ex, Jen. He wasn't waiting for Laura Jean. When we learn that in the second movie, Laura Jean, reasonably so, gets very upset. However, you can't be totally upset with Peter, because throughout this entire movie, Laura Jean has been very hesitant to tell John Ambrose that she and Peter are dating, or to even, to be fair to Laura Jean, she does let Peter know that she's befriended John Ambrose and she's hanging out with him, but she doesn't express that there's something going on there. Both Laura Jean and Peter are hiding things and lying to each other in a certain sense, and that to me is a little concerning, because that is a betrayal of trust. There's very little trust in their foundation so far. Again, this isn't a total end-all be-all, because I think they can totally, anyone in general can rebuild that trust. It takes a very long time, but I don't think it's the end-all be-all. Again, this is just one of those warning signs where there is this cracked foundation between them now, and they're going to have to work really, really hard, potentially in the third movie, to rebuild or at least fix their foundation in some way. Hey, Editing Madison here. I wanted to touch upon something I actually forgot about the first time around. There's a scene at the beginning of the movie that really bothers me. It's Laura Jean's first legitimate date, and they're at this nice restaurant, but Peter drops a fork to be funny because there's a second unnecessary fork. But Peter, you dropping the fork is unnecessary! You can tell this makes Laura Jean uncomfortable. I mean, it upset me too. It did upset me. This whole scene paints Peter as the clownish jerk jock. In the first movie, he wasn't that guy. He kind of broke the stereotype. But in the second movie, he becomes the stereotype. There are several scenes, in fact, throughout this movie that paint Peter in an unflattering light. So it makes it almost easier for you to hop on the John Ambrose train and makes the ending harder to accept. Alright, that's all from Editing Madison. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. This movie spends pretty much its entire running time selling you on the chemistry between Laura Jean and John Ambrose. And they have fantastic chemistry. I ended up falling in love with John Ambrose because at first I was like, back off my man Peter. But by the end of this movie, I was like, John Ambrose, you have my heart. When the ending came around and I was a bleeding heart for John Ambrose, I was disappointed but not surprised with the way everything ended. Everything was very hinted at. Blah, blah, blah. It was also very Hollywood. It took kissing John Ambrose for Laura Jean to realize that Peter's the one. He's always been the one. He'll always be the one. Very trope-like in that sense. So, again, it's like I started to feel for John Ambrose. I was like rooting for him at the end, and I was just kind of like, to Peter. But then the ending comes around, and I was like, well, I'm disappointed, but I'm not surprised. Speaking of chemistry, the chemistry between Peter and Laura Jean this movie was very lackluster. Like, there wasn't that same chemistry that existed in the first movie. That was pretty much gone. I don't know if that's because they wanted to emphasize so much that these two are moving away from each other, that there's a distance growing between them, that they're starting to realize certain things about each other. Like, if they wanted to make that obvious, because you made it obvious, like, probably a little too much. This movie, I wasn't entirely convinced that Laura Jean and Peter even liked each other. You know, just because that chemistry between them was off. Again, I don't know if that was the direction that they decided they wanted to go in to really emphasize, like, Laura Jean and Peter are sort of falling apart and growing distant, blah, blah, blah. But again, it was kind of sad to that chemistry that was there so prevalently in the first movie was just kind of gone in the second. So that was kind of a shame. Again, not a knock to these actors, because the actors are amazing in this film. I personally love them. I am trying to be very understanding that adolescence is a thing. Teenagers do, in fact, do this sort of thing with their first loves. Nothing can ever replace that first love, and first loves are very good at convincing you that they are eternal. And those lucky people out there who happen to, like, end up forever with their first loves, like, first of all, how'd you do it? Second of all, like, that's awesome. Wish I could say the same. It is hard for me a little bit to relate in that sense because I never dated in high school. So I never really had that feeling at that age of this is what your first love is like at that age specifically. So I'm trying to be understanding. I'm trying to assume the mentality of a teenager, of adolescence, where it does take kissing this other person to be like, it's the other one. It's always been the other one, you know, and I'm trying to be understanding of that. And I know I do a lot of hoorah and humbugging about YA and some of the problems that it has, but at the end of the day, this is just entertainment, and I don't want to totally fault this movie for the way it treats Peter and Laura Jean's relationship, because I think that in a way it can be pretty realistic for teenagers to act and to think this way. When you're younger, you absolutely believe that anything will work if you work hard enough, and like it doesn't matter how much you have in common, all that matters is that you love each other. Now, this could just be my sort of cynical approach, but I really believe that you need something in common in order for something to work. I'm not saying that you have to be exactly the same, like you can navigate differences, things like that, but I also think you need more commonalities than you need differences. And I think this movie actually does a pretty good job of illuminating what that's like and what it can do for a relationship. Again, it could just be my cynicism of relationships opposites attract. Could be my cynicism of that really makes me harp on P.S. I Still Love You about how they're approaching this relationship. It could just be me. Share what you think in the comments below. Something else that I found kind of disappointing, it didn't necessarily detract from the movie, but I think it could have added even more. There was some side romances going on throughout this film that I think were really, really cute, and it would have been even nicer, especially with the dad and the neighbor having their relationship, and to talk a little bit more about Laura Jean's reaction to that and how she's coping with all of this. We have a very brief description of that, but I think it would have been pretty cool to kind of see her reconcile her dad moving on from her mom. I think it would have been cool to see that. Which brings me to my other point, Laura Jean and Jen. I think it's really cool that they've kind of hit this ground where they can sort of see where the other one is coming from, and I like that development. I really like that they've started somewhere. I am all for girls being for girls, and like none of this, yo, let's fight each other, let's tear each other down for the guy. Like, I'm all for the opposite side of that, so I was really, really happy to see that. But with all of that and what Laura Jean was going through, I think the pacing of her character development was kind of wonky. It was off a little bit. It felt almost like this thing came out of left field, like the fact that she could reconcile whatever was going on with her and Jean, especially with Peter in the middle. She reconciled it really quickly. From what I could tell, I mean, it's movie time. Movie time does not work the way that real time does. But I think just taking more time to show Laura Jean's development and like reconciling all these things that were happening at once, I think it would have been a really nice addition to this movie to just kind of smooth out that development and the pacing of it a little more. Speaking of Jen and Laura Jean, the other thing that I had a problem with is, again, this is probably just my own personal sentiment, but it is so difficult to reconcile with your boy's ex or your girl's ex or your significant other's ex. I'm speaking from personal experience. When your significant other is still friends and is still close friends with their ex, it brings a whole slew of insecurities. You start wondering, would they choose me again? Or would they choose the person they've known longer, the person they loved first before me? There's a whole slew of insecurities that I faced when my now ex admitted that he was still friends with his ex. It made me feel super insecure, and unfortunately for me, the way my story went is he actually did dump me for his ex. So all those insecurities, all those worries that I felt were realized. Because of my own personal experience, it made me a little worried for Laura Jean and her own insecurities with Jen and Peter. I totally understand them, and I happen to have it be where those fears were actualized, so that sucked. I think it's important to have Laura Jean, I've probably been saying it wrong this whole video. Oh well. Keep in mind those insecurities and just hopefully mention them to Peter and both of them can work together to work through it. I really liked the concept that they introduced. I'm not gonna say because it's a Korean word, but it's basically, it's almost like kindred in a sense. It's not quite that. It's this concept that no matter how your feelings change, you'll always be connected to this person. I really like that concept. I have nothing against it. I think it's really cool. I just have trouble reconciling it with the real world. How do you reconcile the fact that Peter does need Jen and Jen needs Peter in a way that is healthy for all parties involved? So that's my concern about that. Again, I'm all for Lara Jean and Jen being friends, or at least not being enemies anymore. And I really like that sort of almost like girl solidarity message in there. I think that they did a really good job. I also think that this movie does a pretty good job of putting down a solid foundation for the third movie, because I think there's a lot to be said for Lara Jean and the insecurities that she feels and her relationship with Peter. That relationship in general, I think, has a long way to go, to grow, and I think the third movie could really capitalize on that, especially if they stay with the same director. That said, what about my boy John Ambrose? I fell in love with this guy halfway through the movie, and at the end of the movie, he gets nothing. He was just left in the snow at a party at Bellevue for elderly people, and that's it. That's the last we see of him. So if there is a third movie, maybe they'll wrap that up a little bit. He was just kind of left by himself, and you feel so bad for him because I don't know about you, but I personally fell for him and wanted to know what happened next to him. He became the character that I was most invested in. And when you just drop a character that, you know, your audience members are invested in, you leave them going, what? Like I said, I think there's a really good foundation for the third movie. I've never read the books. I have no idea what happens in the books, so I can't compare movies to books. I don't know how the book trilogy does it, but I will say that despite all of the flaws and various other things about this movie that I didn't really care for, and it was a step below the first one, I do think that it does a pretty good job of setting us up for a potential third. And despite everything that I said, go check this movie out, watch it for yourself. Don't take what I have to say for it as law. It's just my opinion, it's just how I saw it, my impression of things. That was To All the Boys, P.S. I Still Love You. I think, despite everything, it was still worth my time. Again, great soundtrack. Whole movie kind of felt like a commercial for it. They're trying to sell you on the music instead of relationships. That does it for this. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Bye! Ugh. It takes forever to get lotion to stop being all gross and sticky.